Hello everyone and welcome back to the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group's 2023 to 2024 programme, It's Complicated. This year's sessions seek to reclaim the phrase "it's complicated" as a tool for unravelling nuanced colonial issues surrounding heritage throughout time. We would like to warmly welcome today's speaker, Jack Ashby. Jack is Assistant Director of the University Museum of Zoology, Cambridge. He is a zoologist and an award-winning author with a focus on the mammals of Australia, the history of how the world came to know and describe them, which is the focus of his most recent book, Platypus Matters, and the colonial biases inherent in natural history museums. Jack's topic today will be Representing Representation, Complicated Identities of Celebrated Figures. Welcome, Jack. The floor is yours.
Yes, as Ria said, I'm Jack and work at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. And my kind of areas of interest as a zoologist are Australian mammals, but the historical context of museums, being surrounded by obviously the stories of where thousands or millions of specimens have come from, has led me to be more interested in those kind of stories of provenance and the historical aspects of natural history, and also how nature is presented in natural history museums. So the colonial and other biases that natural history museums present nature to the world through. And bringing those topics together, a key focus of mine is the colonial history of Australian mammals, mammal collecting. And I've been lucky enough to receive a Headley Fellowship from the Art Fund to look at the colonial history of Australian mammal collecting in my museum, in Cambridge, our museum. And the aims of that is to identify who was truly involved in collecting and scientific development beyond the kind of famous white scientists that we know about, and also the sometimes problematic context in which natural history is being done. So I'm going to take a little time to introduce the topic, but so you know where I'm going. My main question will relate to this man on the screen, Edward Charles Stirling, who is an Australian-born scientist of mixed Scottish and African Jamaican heritage. And my question is about how best to represent his heritage today, given that he didn't seem to acknowledge himself as having African or Jamaican heritage during his lifetime. So I'm asking whether that makes things complicated. And I should say, I'm still very much learning about this as a zoologist, as most of us in the natural history museum sector are. And to be honest, while I've spent a lot of time looking for evidence of a greater diversity of people in the history of our collections, the complexities of race isn't something that I've spent a lot of time have a lot of experience with. So one reason I put forward this talk is so that I could benefit from the wisdom of the group through the discussion section. So I've got a slightly selfish motive here. What it doesn't require a lot of experience to see is that natural history museums have long elevated the work of privileged white men to the exclusion of almost everyone else. So this is, part of our Charles Darwin collection is obviously heroized by every natural history museum, but I guess the point is, we all know that it's not just people like Darwin that contributed to the history of natural history. And I always start talks on this topic with a hat tip to Subhadra Das and Miranda Lowe, who kind of lifted the scales from many people in the natural history museum sector's eyes with this paper, which is where that QR code leads to. I know that people in the history of science and every other museum discipline have been grappling with their colonial histories for decades, but this is quite new, 2018, for natural history museums. And Subhadra and Miranda put out this paper that my own summary of which is on the screen, but it's acted as a wake-up call to a lot of people in the sector. And obviously, decolonial practice like this involves addressing these colonial historical imbalances in the narratives represented in museum galleries and museum programs. And such activities are based on breaking down systemic hierarchies where European narratives are typically being considered superior to any others. For example, by exploring ways that museum collections were put together based on unequal power balances as a product of empire. So in this vein, in recent years, work has begun to acknowledge more honestly how a greater diversity of people were involved in major advances in the history of science and history of culture, history of collecting. And in this work, museums have been undertaking archival research to identify people of color and other people, such as women, who haven't been given due credit despite having made key contributions to the history and collections and disciplines, and also taking the opportunity to better acknowledge their vital roles. And of course, this involves nuance. And my starting point is to acknowledge that in all the years that I've been trying to learn about the history of the collection at the University Museum of Zoology, amongst the vast hordes of white men that are celebrated and acknowledged, there are almost no women and almost no people of colour. And considering that we have 2 million specimens collected by hundreds of people over more than 200 years from every part of the world, that seems vanishingly unlikely to be a reliable reflection of reality. So I'm going to start with a couple of examples that I think are relatively straightforward for deciding how we might represent people and their contributions to the history of science and discovery, and who should be celebrated and who shouldn't be celebrated, before moving on to the meat of my question when I think the approach isn't so obvious. So just as a couple of examples of when it's not complicated, I've spoken about this in this group before, but I've been looking at a collection from Central Australia, from one of the first major scientific expedition to Central Australia, called the Horn Expedition in 1894, on which a huge amount of scientific discovery was made in Australia. It's always been presented as being kind of the work of a small group of kind of elite colonial European scientists. But I've been able to demonstrate that many of the important specimens and species that were encountered on this expedition and the work around it were actually done by Arento women in Central Australia who haven't been given credit. So I think it's not complicated that in telling the story of the discovery of species like the kowari and lesser bilby that are on the screen, that we could incorporate those Arento women's contributions too. Likewise, in the Museum of Zoology, we have an amazing collection of birds of paradise collected by Alfred Russel Wallace, who is perhaps the second most celebrated British naturalist of the 19th century, who co-discovered evolution by natural selection with Darwin, founded the science of biogeography, much to do on these birds of paradise from New Guinea and the Malay archipelago. And I've been able to show that the type specimens, I'll come back to type specimens, but the most important scientific specimens from the voyage were actually collected, many of them by a 15-year-old boy from Sarawak called Ali, including specimens in Cambridge. Again, it's now really easy for us to tell that story of that people like Ali and many other field assistants that Wallace employed deserve credit alongside Wallace's story. So those are not complicated. I think there are examples when it shouldn't be complicated. So I found these specimens in our collection collected by John James Audubon, who is perhaps one of the most celebrated naturalists of the 19th century in America. Founded his legacy includes being a major early proponent of bird conservation. The Audubon Society is the American version of the RSPB. It's perhaps the biggest environmental charity in North America. So he's been long celebrated. These are some birds that Audubon collected in Cambridge, in the Cambridge collection, kept it in the Americas. But I think it should be obvious now that museums need to acknowledge Audubon's white supremacist views and his role as a slaver when we're discussing any of his other legacies and contributions to ecology and conservation. I think we've reached a point where it's not okay not to highlight these when discussing any aspect of Audubon's life and work. Nevertheless, that's become quite a hot topic, particularly in the US. We can pick that up in the discussion if you like. So those are that's all by way of examples. To get onto this point of, is it complicated? These examples when it might be complicated, like Edward Charles Stirling. So Stirling, born in 1848, died in 1919. He's one of the most significant names in the history of Australian zoology. I've come across him many times in my work, and unquestionably, he is one of the most successful scientists of his era in Australia. However, until last year, I'd never come across any reference to the fact that he was not just another example of a successful white colonial scientist. As I mentioned, he had Jamaican and African heritage. His grandmother was a Creole woman in Jamaica. why isn't this part of his widely told story? To what extent is it to do with how he represented himself? Should that affect how we represent him today? Or has his heritage simply been presented as that as a white European for the same biased reasons that colonial era white scientists have generally been elevated from historical narratives? And the question I'll be returning to is if Stirling and others with a similar story are they suitable examples of people that we might choose to celebrate to communicate how far wide a diversity of people contribute to the history of science in the way that we might choose Ali, who worked with Wallace. I guess first, what do we know about Edward Charles or Ted Stirling? He was one of Australia's leading zoologists and anthropologists of the 19th and early 20th century. He also worked as a surgeon. He was born in South Australia, as I said, in 1848, and educated at the University of Cambridge. He became Professor of Physiology at the University of Adelaide, where he helped found the medical school. He was Honorary Director of the South Australia Museum. And through all those roles, he was key to the development of science as an industry in Australia. So he was pushing for the intellectual work about Australia to take place in Australia rather than be exported to London, as I'll get back to. So as well as his contributions to science, he was also a career politician. He was served in the South Australian Legislative Assembly, and during that time he became the first person to propose legislation enabling votes for women. His role on various important scientific expeditions, including the Horn expedition, where he was the expedition's anthropologist, that was the one I mentioned earlier, led him to develop a significant reputation as an anthropologist. However, it's important to note that through this and his museum work, he was heavily involved in the trade in Aboriginal remains. And just to share our connection with him in Cambridge, he was a significant contributor, really important contributor to our collections at the University Museum of Zoology, possibly some of the other museums too. And he continues to have an impact on pretty much every visitor that comes through the doors, in that he donated one of the largest skeletons, or some of the largest skeletons on display in the museum, including this giant wombat relative, the Diprotodon, in the lower gallery, which Stirling had made from casts in the South Australia Museum, from originals in the South Australia Museum. He also donated one of the whales hanging from the ceiling. His contributions to Cambridge have major scientific value too. So he donated type specimens of marsupial moles. So the type specimens are the specimens used to scientifically describe a species. So they underpin pretty much all of natural history. They're the fundamental basis for any species description, on which pretty much every other aspect of natural history rests. So they are the most scientifically valuable specimen in any museum. So he donated these marsupial moles type specimens, along with other Australian mammals and reptiles and fish, giant extinct birds, which he named after Cambridge's professor of zoology, Alfred Newton. So just to tell you about marsupial moles, this is a slight detour. At the time they were first encountered by Europeans, marsupial moles were instantly a target of interest and have remained so ever since. We now know that they are a key example of convergent evolution. So that's where the same traits evolve in different branches of the tree of life to solve the same ecological problem. So in this case, with moles, they have large digging arms, spade-like hands, streamlined bodies, silky fur, small eyes. But these characteristics have developed separately on the evolution of marsupial moles, which are marsupials in Australia, golden moles in Africa, which are related to elephants, and the moles, the taupid moles of Europe and Asia and North America, that if you live in those places, you might be more familiar with. So this is a bit of a detour, but I'm doing it because it actually has a few more touch points to the colonial stories. So with respect to these marsupial moles, new mammals don't get described very often, particularly ones which surprised zoologists as much as this species did. So Stirling wrote the first scientific description of marsupial moles in 1891, they named them Notoryctes typhlops, which was actually suggested by Alfred Newton at the Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. And then he donated some of these specimens that he used to describe the species to our museum. It was described when they came to Cambridge as the most important event in the year in the museum's report. Obviously, First Nations Australians have known about marsupial moles for tens of thousands of years, but the species first came to the attention of Western scientists when Stirling was sent an initial specimen in 1888 it was from Edward Charles Station, which is quite near Charlotte Waters, where that Horn expedition visited. It had been collected alive by one of the station managers there and passed through various hands until it reached Stirling in the South Australian Museum. And it had kind of rotten a fair bit by then. So Stirling was able to describe it as a burrowing animal, and he couldn't determine anything more about it. So he didn't know how it was related to other animals. He wasn't sure if it was a placental mammal like us, a marsupial, or related to platypuses and echidnas. So he didn't give it a name, and he said he needed to collect more specimens. I said this is a bit of a detour, but by 1890, when this letter to Nature was written, or an article in Nature was written in London, European scientists have grown really impatient for new news about this intriguing animal. They thought it could have major implications to their understanding of zoology. So the secretary of the Zoological Society of London, Philip Slater, wrote in Nature, on behalf of the zoologists of this country, the UK, who have waited patiently for 2 years for further information, I now venture to urge Dr. Stirling to send one of his specimens of this extraordinary creature to London and allow us to endeavour to decide what it really is. I need not point out that the extraordinary interest of his discovery. If a monotreme, platypus or echidna relative, as seems probable, it will be the third known from this form of its kind. If it's a marsupial, quite different from everything else, if it turns out to be a placental, it will revolutionise our canons of zoology geographically. So I mention this because there's more than a hint of colonial snobbery going on here. Slater was basically saying scientific discoveries as important as this should be happening in Europe, not Australia. Stirling wrote back to say that he thought Australia should be responsible for its own science, and having acquired 11 more specimens, some of which are these on screen in Cambridge and others we have in Cambridge, fully described the species as a marsupial and sent them to museums around the world. Stirling made clear that it was First Nations Australians who had been largely responsible for providing the specimens based on location. That's probably also a renter people. He said, with the exceptions of the animals having been captured by First Nations Australians, who, with their phenomenal powers of tracking, follow up their traces until they are caught, end quote. So again, these are more examples of people that could be acknowledged in the accounts of the history of species and specimens, but that's not really what I'm talking about. That's the end of the detour. So in researching Stirling's contributions, I came across elements of his biography that I'd not seen before, and what I'm going to describe comes largely from the paper at the end of this QR code, which was written by one of his descendants called Beth Robertson in 2022, called Edward Stirling, which is, as I'll say, Edward Charles's father. It's called Edward Stirling, Embodiment and Beneficiary of Slave Ownership. So as far as I'm aware, Robertson's paper was the first in-depth, accurate look at Stirling's heritage. And he exhibits kind of the complex history of many colonial figures. So his grandfather, Archibald Stirling, who was born in 1769, was a Scottish planter who owned shares in 960 enslaved people on plantations in Jamaica. He received over £12,500 in compensation when slavery was abolished, according to the UCL Legacies of Enslavement database. So presumably this would have had implications for what funds were available to Stirling's family generally, including Edward Charles Stirling, and how he would have benefited from that through compensation. So Archibald, the grandfather, had illegitimate sons in Jamaica, one of whom was E.C. Stirling's father. So that's Edward Stirling, born in 1808, who was mixed race. So his mother was Creole and was possibly called Jeanne or Jean or Jeannie. Many children like Edward would have been abandoned by their white fathers, but Archibald took Edward to Scotland to be educated. Although he didn't live with the family, he was sent away to live with. Well, I don't actually know. He was sent away to live separately. But Archibald also provided Edward with an advanced inheritance of £1,000 to emigrate to South Australia in 1839. I guess we can look at that both as a mix of generosity and a desire to protect Archibald's reputation by creating significant distance between himself and Edward, and the obvious links, the family links to enslavement that Edward embodied. So in Australia, Edward, so this is Edward Charles's father, claimed lands belonging to the Paramount people and started sheep farming. Didn't do so well at first, but eventually made massive successes and became a very successful businessman in the colonial pursuits of farming and trading and mining, before being elected to the Legislative Council of South Australia in 1856. Edward Charles, the son, the person that I'm talking about in Cambridge, was born in 1848, and as a wealthy child in Adelaide's relatively egalitarian society, he thrived in school. The whole family relocated to London to further his education before Edward Charles was admitted to Cambridge and subsequently took up his career in Adelaide in the 1880s. But is it complicated? So considering his significant subsequent career and contributions, celebrating Stirling's success stories could be perfect for increasing representation of people of colour in museum interpretation. But this is where I ask whether it gets complicated. In his lifetime, and this is probably why it hasn't become a significant part of the historical narrative around him, Edward Charles Stirling seems not to have identified publicly as having African or Jamaican heritage. His father appears similarly to have identified himself as a Scotsman rather than to acknowledge his Jamaican roots, and Victorian society kind of went along with that narrative. So I'm unsure how to approach this work, to be honest, and this is the jumping off point for the discussion. So do circumstances like this add complications to the way historical figures are presented today? So I can see there are a couple of obvious options. So should these complexities become part of the story that we tell, as they reflect the social structures that such people were subjected to at the time? So I guess Stirling, did he feel compelled to miss out any mention of his African Jamaican heritage when he was alive? Would doing that undermine the objective of communicating that a greater diversity of people were involved in the history of science, if they felt they had to hide it at the time? Or if the aim is kind of empowerment through representation, do we simply present their heritage as we now understand it to be? So that's where I'm going to end. So I'd be grateful for any thoughts or questions of how best to represent Stirling and people like him.